Welcome, everyone, to From the Ground Up. I am John Boyd, not your host. We talk to entrepreneurs about the companies that they are building and working at, and the hope is that folks out there will get advice that help them with their entrepreneurial journeys. And today I'm joined by SVP of New Product at Mozilla, Peter Rojas. Hi, Peter. How are you?
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, great to have you. We saw that you were available a few weeks ago, and we really wanted to get you on to talk about your experience in the early days of the web, but also what you're doing at Mozilla these days. So, go ahead and just tell us about your background and what you're doing at Mozilla, and then we'll dive into some different things.
Yeah, so I've been in tech for every time I do one of these, it's a bigger number, but now almost 30 years been in tech, which is kind of crazy to think about. But someone who actually started off on the journalism side and at a magazine called Red Herring, which was the magazine sort of chronicling the dot-com boom and then bust. And after being laid off when things kind of fell apart in 2001, ended up in 2002, almost not by choice, becoming entrepreneurial and starting Gizmodo and Gawker Media. And getting really involved in blogging early on, and really trying to think about blogging as not just a personal sort of journal format, but something that you could take advantage of the flexibility and frankly the essentially like free cost of publishing, now that a CMS, a content management system, was essentially free, to be able to kind of reimagine how you would create like a publication on the internet. Gizmodo and Gawker obviously saw a lot of success. I ended up a couple of years after that leaving to start Weblogs Inc. And starting a site called Engadget, and also Joystick, which was the first video game blog. And sold that company to AOL in 2005. So we had a very quick sort of launch to acquisition in about 18 months, which can really spoil you, honestly, as a founder when you see things grow that quickly. And Engadget itself grew. We went from zero to like 10 or 15 million readers a month in like 2 years or something like that. It was just like a phenomenal ride. And stayed at AOL for a few years. Ended up starting a couple of new companies, two at the same time, which I would never recommend actually. And one focused on music discovery, the other on social commerce. The social commerce company actually also ended up being acquired by AOL in 2013. And at AOL, I was VP of strategy, kind of helping them navigate the transition to mobile, which they were very much lagging behind in. And AOL, of course, being kind of a legacy company, even 10, 15 years ago. And started my first sort of in-house innovation organization called Alpha there at AOL, and we focused on incubating new mobile and also Apple Watch apps. We actually got early access to the Apple Watch SDK before the Apple Watch was announced, which was kind of cool. And then spent a few years there. Wasn't sure exactly what I wanted to do next, and got an offer to start a venture fund with one of my former investors. And so we started BetaWorks Ventures, which was an outgrowth of BetaWorks, which had actually been a product studio before that. And Giphy, maybe the most successful product which came out of there. But they also did TweetDeck and Chartbeat and Bitly and a few other things. Very
Wow,
prominent sort of Web 2.0.
they're being
And
used. They're all being used.
Yeah, no, all still like very successful, products for the most part. So was there for about 6 years. Invested in over 100 companies. My probably the one thing that'll be on my VC tombstone was I was the first investor in Hugging Face, which is one of the pioneers of open source AI. When we invested, it was just a couple of kids from France who were creating an app which was like a BFF chatbot for teen girls, which is why the
Okay,
name Hugging Face came from. And
right.
so, they ended up having multiple pivots, and I got to see firsthand what that process looks like of, having something getting into market, and then going through lots and lots of pivots, and then eventually getting to like monster success with like a very different kind of, kind of business proposition. So that was an interesting thing to, have a front row seat for. And then after 6 years of VC, I got that itch to start to get closer to building and operating again. And Meta reached out about being head of product for their new product experimentation group. I think when you do the LinkedIn search, there are relatively few people who have run an innovation group like that, and so they found me. And so I spent 3 years there, and then ended up coming to Mozilla almost exactly a year ago now, and in February of last year, to lead new products there. and really loved the fact that one, there are very few brands that are sort of as kind of foundational to the web as Mozilla and Firefox, right? And the legacy there. But also really the opportunity to, think about how do you build with intention and thinking about the mission that we have to make the internet something that everybody can participate in. And it's something that everyone can contribute to. And, but also to really help them with some, big challenges around revenue diversification and, figuring out how to, make new successful products. So that's
Yeah.
how I got to now.
Yeah, there we go. I mean, I asked for it. It's basically it's one of those things where you hear somebody who, especially folks like you, who sort of got started in the earlier, scrappier days of the beginning of the internet, kind of definitely. When you hear somebody talk about their bona fides through all of that, you want to, like me as an interviewer, I want to just ask questions about every single step of the way, but obviously we have to be careful on that. But I think the main well, I think the good thing to do is to connect those earlier scrappy internet days and sort of plug them into how you're what you're doing at Mozilla right now with working on new product there. How does it inform uh, what you're doing now?
Yeah. I mean, I think it almost goes a little bit deeper in that, I was someone who, grew up in the 80s and 90s and was in college in the 90s and was very active in sort of like the DIY, like hardcore punk scene. And really love this idea of, especially in what seemed like a kind of like a media monoculture, right? Where everything was like, we forget, but like at the time it was like big media companies sort of top down. You didn't have a lot of choice, so to speak. It was like there were 3 networks on TV and then 4 with Fox, I guess. And so, I think that for those of us who are a little older, like we remember what it's like when, you didn't necessarily have, all the infinite number of options and choice and that we do today, right? We're almost embarrassed. It's like we have an abundance of options. And so, as someone who is interested in, punk, sort of realizing, oh, I can actually, put out my own zines and I can put out my own records and I don't need somebody's permission. I don't need the gatekeeper. I don't need, some major label to like decide that I'm good enough, to be able to like, contribute what I'm interested, to share what I'm passionate about. And so, when I discovered the internet in the 90s, I actually got on the internet actually in like 89, 90 with like, dial up, BBSs and stuff like that. But when, with the web, like really kind of starting to see that, it really can democratize, media and participation, and like we can all have a voice and we can all, put something out there. And so that seemed really punk rock to me. And so, in the same way that like the ethos behind Gizmodo and Engadget were very much like punk rock. Like we're insurgents. We're, we don't have to play by the same rules. Obviously, we uphold like actually journalistic standards and credibility and all that stuff. But but we can have a different style and tone. We can cover things that maybe other publications aren't going to talk about because they're not like considered important enough or like broad enough, right? We can go niche. And I think that, coming from a subculture where you're not necessarily trying to appeal to everybody, helped kind of give me this perspective of the internet allows us to sort of build and be a place where lots of people can participate, and we don't have to do everything for everybody. But we need to like at least support everyone being able to have a seat at the table and have a voice and be a participant. And so, I think one of the things that like, again, to tie it back to the work that we're doing at Mozilla now, it's really, how can we, think about the internet as a resource, right? As a public good, as something that like, we want to make sure that is a level playing field, that, whether, you're an individual or even a small business or even a larger business, that like you have something that you can trust, that you have choice, that you have transparency, that you are not downstream of some unknowable algorithm, which is, might put your livelihood or your business at risk. And so, when we think about like all the things that really matter right now, the fact that like, I think again, for those of us who remember the very early days, we don't necessarily take the internet for granted. We know how fragile it is, and we know how valuable it is to be able to participate, and that we don't necessarily assume that like, that everybody is always going to have the kind of access to participate that like, that those of us who were, in there very early, like were able to take advantage of.
I mean, you caused me to think about a Saturday Night Live skit that I saw very recently on one of their shows where there's a mother and there's a father and there's the kids, and the mom is, kind of, she has her opinions about things, and it may be because she might be a little bit uninformed. And the dad makes the comment and says, "Kids, you know that mom uses a form of internet that's, what did he say? That's she uses an older computer."
Computer. It's a different internet. I saw that sketch. It was great.
And the
Um,
kids are like, "Dad, that's not a thing." But the
yeah.
mom's like, "Oh, yes, it is." Anyway,
Yeah.
so
And
that
one
could
thing
be
I'll add is that like,
content.
we have learned, right, that like giving everyone a platform and everyone a voice has its downsides too, right? Like it does mean
Right.
that like there's misinformation, there are bad actors or people acting in bad faith, right? And so it actually means that like the systems that we create matter even more, right? The fact that like, that for most people, the internet that they access, again, isn't like the internet that, I was engaging with 30 years ago. It's now, you're engaging with what an algorithm is showing you, right? For the most part. And so again, I think this is why for us, some a part of our values are, again, we are, we use AI, right? We obviously like, we're not, we're not Luddites or burying our heads in the sand. We're technologists too, but we acknowledge that we need to have a sophisticated view on this stuff, and we need to be able to understand the implications of the decisions of the systems that we build and the products that we build.
Yeah, totally makes sense. Okay, so for those of the folks out there, there are people who are in the know and they know what Mozilla is and they know what open source is all about. For those out there who aren't all that knowledgeable about it, tell us a little bit more about, sort of the general mission of Mozilla, and then also the specific, I guess some types of products that Mozilla is putting out there, and maybe some of the stuff that you're working on and choosing, and all of that.
Yeah. So if you know us, you may not know Mozilla, but you probably know Firefox.
Right.
And even if you don't use Firefox now, there's a good chance that you used it in the past, right? Um, you know, we have that is our flagship product here. It's obviously been one of the most important products I think in the history of the web, right? And really critical. Was introduced at a time when it seemed like Microsoft with Internet Explorer was going to essentially monopolize the web. And Firefox was created largely to be able to as a counterbalance that to that, right? And to sort of say, look, the web is too important for one company to be able to dictate what it means. And so Firefox continues to be an incredibly important voice around advocating for web standards, right, and making sure that the web isn't something that just the two biggest browser makers now, which are Apple and Google with Safari and Chrome, that they don't just determine what counts as the web, right? That because we are making and Firefox is powered by our own independent browser engine called Gecko, and that means that like we really have a strong hand in shaping what counts as the web. And again, and really like, as our mission is to center the users and to make sure that someone is advocating for them. Whereas you can imagine with Apple and Google, they may have different interests, around, what the web should be and how that aligns best with their business interests. Because we're backed by a nonprofit. Obviously we do need to make money to, creating a browser and a browser engine. Does cost money, right? I wish it didn't, but it does. And we want to make sure that the really talented people that make Firefox are compensated and paid for that work. But it does mean that but it also means that like we continue to center and advocate for the users of the web and make sure that like at a minimum that like we're advancing those interests rather than sort of just driving hard towards like how can we make the most money, because that is not our objective.
Yeah, it's about finding that balance. So when you're trying to shift away from that sort of exploration focused side of things at the company to something, meeting revenue targets, do you encounter resistance? Is there a resistance somewhere? Where is the resistance? Is it in the people, the processes, something
You know,
else?
yeah, I don't think it's so much. I don't really encounter a lot of that. I think it's when I came in about a year ago. Uh, I said I really wanted to understand. When you have an organization like this, its purpose can take a lot of different forms. Like for example, at Meta, while we did have some goals around, they weren't revenue goals, they were more, like user goals. But it was also, how can we learn about new categories? I had teams in Lagos, Nigeria, and in Seoul, South Korea, and in part it was how can we build things to better understand users that are outside of, the U.S. and Europe, right? Um, that is, and that's that. So these groups can have different objectives. When I came into Mozilla, I really want to understand what does Mozilla need from an organization like this? What kind of purpose can we have? And then how can I, drive like sort of extreme clarity around how we can deliver the right kind of impact for Mozilla? And one of the things I came to understand is that, it's important for us to drive revenue diversification, to make sure that we're not wholly dependent on, Firefox as a source of revenue. And so, we're building a set of products which are monetizing in different ways. Like for example, we have a website builder called Solo, and Solo makes it incredibly easy to make a website. For example, I have a 13-year-old who makes comics. I was able to make a website for his comics in probably about 90 seconds. And so we want to make it like really easy for the average person to be able to create their own presence on the internet. That it's not just a Facebook page or Instagram page or something like that. That they can actually own their own domain. We make everything super easy, right? And that's and we have a pro subscription for that. If you want to, if you don't want to pay, there are free options. But if you want the upgrades and premium features and stuff like that, we have a subscription, and that is starting to see some nice growth. We're going to introduce later this year a secure enterprise version of Firefox. One of the things that we understand, there are a lot of thousands and thousands of companies that use Firefox in the corporate environment. And we don't offer them a lot of the security features and policy tools and things like that that they need, given how critical the browser has become as almost like an OS, right? Like that's where I mean, we're using Riverside in the browser right now, right? It's for this podcast, right? All the tools and things like that. And so we have a team that is building that, and it'll ship later this year. And that will be a paid product, right? It will be you'll pay per seat, like enterprise software. And so, there's a number of different ways that we think that we can, engage with kind of, companies, audiences, users, and groups that isn't just, giving them a browser for free, which, we want everyone to use Firefox. We think it can be valuable. But we think there are other ways that we can serve, our mission that also, create value. And, one of the things that I always try to think about is, when we talk about creating value, it's not just in, what we can charge people for or what we can monetize. It's also the fact that we deliver trust, right? We deliver choice, we deliver transparency. And, we offer value to, our various users, customers, et cetera, in different ways with different products. But the promise and of the mission, sort of threads through all of those.
I want you to walk me through a Mozilla Pioneers program. It's one of the things that you guys have going on right now, and it involves sort of embedding outside creators. And I suppose talk to me a little bit about. I mean, how does that sort of reach back to your punk rock roots as well? I mean, because it kind of does. Right?
Pioneers. I was really excited to do this here at Mozilla. It felt like exactly the kind of place where we could do a program like this. So Pioneers is essentially I almost think of it as like a residency program where we're going to invite a handful of builders to come and spend a couple of months, prototyping, exploring product ideas. And at the end of that process, we will hopefully be able to offer, assuming the ideas are good enough, right? I mean, not everything works out, but be able to offer, at least one of those individuals the opportunity to join Mozilla full time and get a team to go and build and bring their product to market. And so, there's a bunch of things that I love about this. One is it's very much in keeping with the spirit of Mozilla. We've so much been about the community and really engaging with our community and also acknowledging that we don't have all the ideas. I could sit there and generate ideas, and I do all the time. And I have a list of things that I'm, always thinking about and considering. But I think it's really healthy to open yourself up to different ideas, different perspectives, different backgrounds, right? And so, we believe that the internet, since it is for everybody, it needs to be built by everybody. And so this is one very small way that I think that we can tap into, people that share our values, support our mission, and want to be able to build something. And so a key component of Pioneers, which I think is really important, is, we're opening it up to something that people can do part-time. Now, a lot of these residency programs, it's sort of like, hey, like quit your job, or maybe you don't already have a job, or you're in between things, come and spend like 2 or 3 months. Um, as you can
Advice.
imagine,
Yeah.
yeah, like, or like a YC or something like that. As you can imagine, like that'll, that ends up biasing towards people who either, are really young, maybe, or people who, have are independently wealthy already, or have the means, to do a program like that. I really wanted to open it up to people who might, be great at this, might have amazing ideas, but, you can't ask them, hey, quit your job, do this for 2 or 3 months. You might not have a job at the other side of it.
Yeah.
That doesn't seem very fair to me. And so, we thought about like, well, how can we reduce the risk while still, getting access to these really talented people? And so, I think that, my goal was really, to, again, I'm always trying to democratize, trying to give people, like to increase access and participation. And this seemed to me at least one way that we could kind of widen the aperture of people who could, who'd want to apply and participate in something like this.
And what does it look like as far as how many over the next several months you're accepting sort of new, or what's the timeline on it?
Yeah, so we're accepting applications until February 16th. And
Okay.
so, and then we'll spend, a few
Got it.
weeks
Yeah.
reviewing applications, interviewing people after that. And then, we'll have people ideally start actually in March and spend a couple months with us. You'll get, kind of hands-on mentorship. Obviously get to meet with me pretty regularly, maybe more regularly than you want to,
Yeah.
depending on, we have obviously like tons of talented people both within the new products organization at Mozilla. We have, user researchers. We have, amazing engineers and designers and thinkers and, analysts and things like that. And so, it'll be a real opportunity to like kind of embed yourself, here. It's almost like, a bit like almost like a summer camp program in a way, where it's like you get to spend like a couple of months, spending time with like really talented people, and frankly being able to like work and prototype your ideas. I think one of the things that's really amazing right now is, because of these tools like Replit and Lovable and others, you can actually build a prototype yourself, relatively easily. And when I just remember, when I did this job at AOL, which is like 13 years ago, 14 years ago, and obviously at Meta. It would take time to build a prototype, an MVP of something. And now we don't necessarily need to have, months and months of development time or weeks and weeks of development time just to build a prototype, just to explore a concept. We can build it and have some idea of it even in just an hour. And I think that like, it also means that we can, again, there are people who might not normally think of themselves as, being suitable for a program like this, but like, but they are passionate about making new things. Well, here's a way to like do it, align with our mission and in alignment with our mission. But, and it's paid, and if it's something that, that doesn't work out necessarily, you haven't put your whole life on hold. You haven't, you haven't taken a big risk, in the sense that like, maybe you left your job or passed up other opportunities.
Um, you know, uh, Deciding on which early stage ideas to go with. I'd love to hear sort of your perspective on that, and maybe how if it's not working out.
Yeah.
Yeah, talk to us about your process for that.
Yeah. So, we spent a lot of time evaluating new concepts, and, you know, there are various ways and frameworks that you can do it. And sometimes it depends on the category that you're looking at, right? Whether it's consumer or enterprise or developer tool, et cetera. But one of the things that like, for me to start out is, can you tell a narrative of why this might be successful? And this kind of comes from my own startup days and as a VC, and really trying to understand, okay, yes, things will go in different directions. There might be pivots, et cetera. But at least like frame up for me, if this were to be successful, what does that story look like? And then taking a step back of trying to understand, okay, when we think about the product strategy and the monetization strategy and the, customer acquisition strategy, how do those work in harmony with one another? And I think that one of the mistakes that, builders can make is to think about these as isolated threads. To think about it as like, well, I'm going to do the product, and then I'm going to figure out monetization, and then I'm going to figure out my go to market or my user acquisition strategy. And I think, a more sophisticated approach is to say, well, these actually inform one another. Like they're sort of threaded together. And when you pull one, it can deform the others, right? And so you have to, you can't really think of them as in isolation anymore. You have to think about how they all are really, they're not the same thing, obviously, but they are bound up with one another in ways that like you have to be able to think through and really understand the implications of. And so, that's again part of it. And then I think you want to be able to, get feedback as quickly as possible on what you're building. The thing I always tell my team members is speed of market discovery is often the difference between success and failure. Whether you're building a startup, big company, et cetera, how quickly can you understand what the market needs and wants and whether you have the right thing? And, if you're taking, 3-4 months in between iterations, you're probably not going to cut it, right? You need to be able to go out there, but you also need to make sure that with every version of your product that you have a question that you're trying to answer. You're not just shipping just to ship. You're saying, okay, with this version, now I want to test out a pricing model, or I want to test out acquisition, or I want to test out if this feature drives more engagement, or I want to understand if we change the sign up flow, does it get more people from A to B, for example. And I think as a builder, I think you really have to, think about every time that you ship something, that you have a question or set of questions that you want to get answers to, but that you also can get answers to, and that you understand what is the difference between a yes or a no, or a signal or a not signal. And so if you can continue to be really disciplined about that, it doesn't mean you're always going to find success, but at least you can continually move towards, giving yourself an opportunity. And then, to answer your other question, I think that, if you get to a place where you're not seeing that signal and there aren't really like a meaningful pivot you can make where you think you might get, some different result, that is when you have to kind of pull the plug. And that can feel like more art than science. It can be very subjective. And it can be very contentious, right? Because, sometimes I might have a different opinion than, other people, right, on this. One of the things I love about this place is that, we're very intellectually honest. We're very transparent. And, when something isn't working, at least in my, the year, I often see that it's the team themselves are saying, well, it's time that we need to make a change.
Got it. Yeah. Defining success, is it, well, I mean, I'm torn between asking you how it looks different now than the way it looked back in 10, 20 years ago. But I'm also interested in sort of the whole mission driven thing. Like is if something is a success for Mozilla and its mission, is that different than the way it might look for a company that doesn't have that mission driven aspect to it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say that for starters, like, we're never going to compromise our values. And so, you can imagine that there are things that we might build that, we would say, well, this isn't, we don't think this is, centers the user or respects the customer. We don't think that this, aligns with how we, our policies around data usage or privacy or transparency, right? So there are certainly, business implications that can happen. I also tend to be of the belief that, in the long run, that, having those values and conveying them in our products is actually a way that we can win, right? And that we do win. And so, I think that it sort of gives as much as it gives us as much of an advantage as it sometimes constrains us in other ways, right? I also think that it's when you're trying to build things, it's actually really helpful to to have things that help kind of create contours around how you should think about what you're building, and how you want to approach the market. And certainly, we're the beneficiaries of having like an amazing brand, right, with Mozilla, and with Firefox, that is trusted, that that users and customers know. And so when we do introduce new things, often we hear from people, you know I don't know a lot about this category, for example, but like it's from Mozilla, so like I think I can trust it, and that goes a long way, especially when you're working with developers who can be some of the most skeptical users you can imagine, right? Like they're very sophisticated, they're highly technical, and you can't kind of pull one over on them, right? Like you can't sort of say you can't say something and have it not be true, because they will get into the hood, under the hood, and like
Mm-hmm.
interrogate what you're actually delivering, right? And I think it's good to be able to work at a place where we go the extra mile to make sure that we are living up to our promises with respect to that. That said, I mean, we do have a goal of delivering, as I mentioned, revenue diversification. We do want to make money, but I think that like again, with the things that we're building, whether it's Solo with a premium subscription, or Firefox Enterprise with its enterprise, it's a software model. We have TapStack, which is a programmable API for the web, which we sell sort of on a per API call model. Um, you know, we think that like we're delivering something of value. We're doing it in a way that again is transparent, fair, and trustworthy. Um, but and we're operating in ways that I think that our customers can understand, and if they get value from it, that's great. And we think that it's another way that we can help support Mozilla and our mission. And if we're not successful in that, it does mean that we change course, shut things down. And I think that's a natural thing. It's hard. Making new things is hard anywhere. It's not a Mozilla specific thing, right? You look at any tech company, especially the big ones that have been around a while. They all have lots and lots of products that they've introduced, and then have not found success in the market and then shut down, right? That's just the way it is, and it's no different for us than anybody else. I think that in the long run, my perspective and how I would define success is, can we both advance our mission with the products that we're building, but can we also create a maybe a firmer long-term foundation for Mozilla by diversifying our revenue? And I don't think those are in contradiction at all. I think those are mutually supporting.
One final question here. There are, of course, other founders out there, and they're looking to innovate into their company, add innovation into their companies as well. What's like a key thing that you found that works for you at Mozilla that you guys are doing that you would, give as advice to any of those founders out there?
The thing that I always remind myself of is you just don't you can't sort of delude yourself when something is working or when it's not. And I think that's something that can be really difficult, and something that I saw a lot, even in myself as a founder. You get sort of, you make something and you become so anchored to wanting it to work that you don't realize it's time to maybe let go and move on from it. And I think that, when it comes to innovation, you have to understand that you're probably going to fail more than you succeed. And that, when we go and see, things that, all these big successful products that people are talking about, in TechCrunch and, other places, we mainly see this, we only really see the successes. All the tons and tons of, failures and misfires and things that pivoted, those get obscured. Right. And I don't know anybody who has been successful who hasn't had, a failure so bad that it made them question everything that they've ever done, myself included. Right. And I think that, if you continue to stay connected to, what you really care about and what you really value and what animates you, that's how you pull through that stuff. And so, I think it can be hard to acknowledge and sort of have to accept that you got something wrong. I know it's hard for me, you know? um, and I have to,
Me
remind
too.
myself all the time, uh, you're going to make mistakes, and I did some, I made a mistake about something recently, and I still I'm thinking about it all the time, because it's like, and you have to learn from them, right? And you have to acknowledge that, like, you're
Yeah,
not always going to get everything right. I want to be right 100% of the time, right? I really do.
me too.
But yeah, and it's tough. But I think that, like, once you have that humility and you sort of accept that, you're probably going to be more wrong than right. Um, as long as you're just persistent and continuing to try new things and being, nimble, eventually you can, I'm not always, but eventually you can probably find something that is, if not, that is at least successful in the terms that you care about.
Peter, it's been great to have you on the show. God, I wish I could just ask you just about the late '90s. Just do a podcast on just the late '90s, but because those were the days, but or the early 2000s, those were fun too, or 2005. Anyway, we could.
Yeah.
It's great to have you on the show. Thank you for giving us insight into your work at Mozilla and developing product, and yeah, great to have you on the show.
No, thank you so much for having me on and giving me a chance to talk about all the really cool stuff that we're doing here.
Yeah, and the Pioneers program, they better sign up for that. Check that out.
Yes, it's I've got the URL is I gotta find that. Make sure I get that right. Um, well, if you Google like Mozilla Pioneers, you'll find it. You'll find the application
Yeah.
page.
Great to have you on the show, Peter.
All right, thank you.